The stolen recipe for the village cake sale, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with something deceptively simple, a handwritten recipe meant for the annual village cake sale. Carefully guarded and proudly perfected over generations, the recipe vanishes just days before the event, leaving behind confusion, hurt pride, and whispered accusations. The villagers treat it as petty rivalry, nothing more than a baking dispute. But Miss Marple notices the tension beneath the smiles, the sudden change in behavior, the carefully avoided conversations, and the fact that the recipe was stolen for reasons far more serious than winning a prize ribbon. As she looks closer, it becomes clear that the missing recipe holds more than instructions for a cake. It hides a connection to the past that someone is desperate to keep from coming to light. Because in St. Mary Mead, even the sweetest traditions can conceal the darkest secrets. Before we uncover why the recipe was truly taken, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Stolen Recipe for the Village Cake Sale. On the morning the recipe vanished, the village of St. Mary Mead woke beneath a sky the color of cooling porridge, pale and undecided, as though the day itself had not yet chosen what sort of trouble it meant to bring. Chimneys breathed thin ribbons of smoke, doors were opened with familiar caution, and the quiet expectation of the annual cake sale settled over the cottages like a held breath. It was the sort of morning that suggested comfort and tradition, yet such mornings, Miss Marple often observed, were precisely the ones that hid the most mischief, for wickedness preferred to arrive wearing an apron and a smile. The cake sale was to be held in the parish hall by noon, and by 8 o'clock the village was already stirring with purpose. Baskets lined with clean cloths were being filled, tins were polished, and recipes passed down through generations were brought out with reverence. None was more spoken of, nor more guarded, than the famous honey spice cake belonging to Mrs. Edith Cranwell, a cake so consistently perfect that its absence from the table would have been noticed even by those who claimed not to care for sweets. Mrs. Cranwell herself was a woman of firm opinions and careful habits, and she treated that recipe as one might treat a valuable heirloom, with pride, suspicion, and an insistence on knowing exactly where it was at all times. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting balanced neatly on her knees, watched Mrs. Cranwell march past her gate with a basket held as stiffly as her spine. There was a tightness to the woman's mouth that suggested more than ordinary concentration. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough for her to note that something was amiss. It was a small thing, the sort that others would dismiss as nerves over baking, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that disturbances rarely announced themselves with fanfare. They arrived quietly, like a missing ingredient. It was not until 9:30 that the first alarm sounded, and even then it came disguised as irritation. Mrs. Cranwell's voice rose within the walls of her kitchen, sharp with disbelief, as she turned drawers inside out and lifted jars she had not moved in years. The recipe, always kept folded inside a blue envelope in the bread tin, was not there. At first she told herself she had been careless, that age had finally dulled her memory, yet the more she searched, the more certain she became that carelessness was not the answer. She was a woman who counted her spoons and remembered the exact weight of flour by feel alone. She did not misplace things of importance. By the time Miss Marple arrived, summoned by a breathless neighbor who could not resist sharing news of a disturbance, Mrs. Cranwell was seated at the kitchen table, pale and trembling, with the bread tin open before her like an accusation. The kitchen smelled of sugar and warm spice, and the unfinished cake sat cooling by the window, perfect in every respect except for the fact that its maker now doubted whether it was truly hers. Miss Marple listened without interruption as the story poured out, her expression mild, her eyes attentive in a way that made people say more than they intended. It was not merely the loss of a piece of paper that troubled Mrs. Cranwell, but the violation of it. That recipe had been written in her mother's hand, adjusted over years with careful notes in the margin, and guarded as fiercely as one might guard a secret. Only a handful of people had been in her kitchen that week, all of them neighbors, all of them trusted. To suggest that one of them had taken it was unthinkable, and yet, as Miss Marple knew too well, unthinkable things occurred with remarkable frequency among people who prided themselves on decency. Word spread quickly, as it always did in a village where news traveled faster than the post. By the time the church bell struck 10, speculation had already taken root. Some said the recipe would turn up under a pile of flour or tucked into a cookbook by mistake. Others suggested, in lowered voices, that rivalry over the cake sale prizes had grown more serious this year. The blue ribbon for best cake came with a modest sum and, more importantly, the admiration of the entire village. Pride, Miss Marple reflected, was often a far stronger motive than money. As she made her way toward the parish hall, Miss Marple encountered faces flushed with anticipation and something sharper beneath it. Mrs. Wills, who baked a respectable lemon cake and had placed second to Mrs. Cranwell 3 years in a row, was speaking with unusual animation. Mr. Harper, the grocer, lingered longer than necessary over his delivery of sugar. Even young Lucy Benton, who claimed she baked only for pleasure, asked questions that sounded curiously precise. Miss Marple noted each detail without comment, storing them away as she stored her wool, neatly wound and ready for use. The parish hall itself was already busy, tables being arranged and cloths smoothed with anxious hands. The absence of Mrs. Cranwell's cake had not yet been announced, but its shadow lay over the room nonetheless. Miss Marple took her usual seat near the window, where she could observe without appearing to do so. From there she watched how people avoided one another's eyes, how voices lowered when the missing recipe was mentioned, and how the atmosphere shifted from cheerful competition to something far more strained. It was then that Miss Marple heard the first suggestion of deliberate theft, spoken not as an accusation but as a fearful possibility. If the recipe had been taken, the thief would need time to use it, which meant the act had been planned. Planned acts, Miss Marple knew, were rarely the work of impulse. They were born of long-standing resentment, quiet envy, or a sense of injustice nurtured over years. Such feelings did not vanish with age or respectability. They simply learned to hide. As the morning wore on, the list of those who had visited Mrs. Cranwell's kitchen was examined and re-examined. Mrs. Wills had borrowed a tin. Mr. Harper had delivered ingredients. Lucy Benton had helped wash dishes one afternoon. Each visit seemed innocent enough, yet innocence, like a cake, depended entirely on what went into it. Miss Marple asked gentle questions, her tone mild, her knitting clicking steadily, and was rewarded with more information than any direct interrogation could have produced. What struck her most was not who spoke, but how they spoke. There was defensiveness where none should be, eagerness where calm would have been expected. Mrs. Cranwell herself insisted she wanted no fuss, yet her eyes darted to every doorway. She feared not only the loss of her recipe but what its disappearance suggested about the people she lived among. Trust, once cracked, never fit together quite the same way again. By 11 o'clock, the matter could no longer be ignored. The cake sale was to begin in an hour, and the absence of the celebrated honey spice cake would be noticed at once. Miss Marple, folding her knitting with deliberate care, felt the familiar tightening of purpose that always came when a mystery presented itself not with violence, but with something far more unsettling, the quiet theft of trust. She reflected that human nature, like baking, followed certain patterns. Change one ingredient, remove one familiar element, and the whole result was altered. As the bell rang again, calling villagers toward the hall, Miss Marple rose, her expression serene. Somewhere among these familiar faces was a person who believed they could take what was not theirs and suffer no consequence. Miss Marple had seen such beliefs before, and she knew how they ended. With a final glance toward the door through which Mrs. Cranwell would soon enter, Miss Marple resolved that before the day was done, the truth, like a well-baked cake, would rise no matter how carefully it had been hidden. Chapter 2: The Village That Baked with Secrets. By the time the cake sale opened its doors, the loss of the recipe had settled over St. Mary Mead like a draft creeping under a door, unwelcome yet impossible to ignore. The tables were laden with sponge cakes, fruit loaves, tarts, and slices arranged with care, but there was a conspicuous gap where Mrs. Cranwell's honey spice cake should have stood. People paused there without quite meaning to, their eyes drawn to the empty space as though expecting the missing cake to appear of its own accord, late but triumphant. It did not, and with each passing minute, the absence grew louder than any announcement. Miss Marple took in the scene with quiet attention. She had attended enough village gatherings to know when cheer was genuine and when it was merely polite. Laughter rang out too sharply, compliments were offered with just a shade too much emphasis, and the usual easy chatter carried an edge of strain. The cake sale, meant to be a celebration of shared effort, had become an unspoken examination of character, and everyone knew it, whether they admitted it or not. Mrs. Cranwell arrived shortly after the doors opened, her face composed with visible effort. She carried her basket with the dignity of someone determined not to invite pity, though it was clear that every glance toward the tables was a reminder of what had been taken from her. Miss Marple watched the way conversations faltered as Mrs. Cranwell passed, how hands tightened on teacups and smiles stiffened. Nothing so unsettled people as the thought that one of their own might be capable of quiet wrongdoing. As the first customers arrived, Miss Marple moved slowly among the tables, her manner unhurried, her eyes observant. She spoke to no one directly about the missing recipe, yet the subject surfaced again and again, as naturally as yeast in warm dough. Mrs. Wills remarked, a little too quickly, that she had always thought the honey spice cake overrated. Mr. Harper mentioned, with forced cheer, that variety was good for a sale like this. Lucy Benton, blushing furiously, insisted she would never dream of using another person's work. Each comment revealed more than the speaker intended, and Miss Marple noted them all. What interested her most was not who protested innocence, but who did not. There were those who avoided the subject entirely, who spoke instead of weather and jam jars and the rising cost of sugar. Avoidance, Miss Marple knew, could be as telling as denial. In her long experience, people rarely hid from accusations unless they feared where such talk might lead, even if they had done nothing wrong. Fear had a way of tangling the truth. Miss Marple found herself beside Mrs. Wills's table, examining a neatly iced lemon cake. Mrs. Wills stood stiffly, her hands folded, her smile strained. When Miss Marple complimented the cake, the woman's relief was almost visible. She spoke at length about the difficulty of achieving the right balance of flavor, about how recipes were never truly finished, always changing with experience. Miss Marple listened, nodding, thinking how easily admiration could slide into resentment when effort went unrecognized year after year. Across the hall, Mr. Harper hovered near his display of baked goods, offering advice no one had asked for. His eyes flicked often toward Mrs. Cranwell, then away again. Miss Marple recalled how familiar he was with the comings and goings of every household, how he knew who ordered extra sugar and who suddenly required unusual ingredients. Grocers, she reflected, heard more than they should and remembered selectively. Knowledge, like flour, could be used to nourish or to conceal. As the morning progressed, whispers grew bolder. Someone suggested that the recipe might already be in use, that another cake on the table could be its imitation. This idea spread quickly, and soon people were tasting with new attention, searching for the familiar warmth of spice and sweetness of honey. Miss Marple observed the careful sampling, the narrowed eyes, the polite nods. There was disappointment in every bite, and perhaps a hint of relief. To find the stolen recipe openly displayed would have been shocking. To find nothing was merely frustrating. Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Cranwell, who spoke little, her pride wounded more deeply than she wished to admit. When she did speak, it was to recall small moments from the past week, details she had dismissed at the time. A cupboard left ajar, a pause in conversation when she entered the room, a question asked too casually. Miss Marple encouraged her gently, knowing that memory, once prompted, often revealed more than logic ever could. Outside the hall, children played, oblivious to the tension within, their laughter a sharp contrast to the careful politeness inside. Miss Marple watched them through the window and thought how innocence was often louder than guilt, how the very ease of it could make adult unease seem all the more pronounced. She wondered, as she often did, whether wrongdoing was less a matter of cruelty than of small justifications repeated until they sounded reasonable. By early afternoon, the sale was winding down. The cakes had sold well enough, though the enthusiasm felt forced, as if everyone were waiting for a second act that had yet to arrive. Miss Marple sensed impatience growing, a desire for resolution that had nowhere to settle. Uncertainty, she knew, was far more uncomfortable than accusation. People would rather face blame than linger in doubt. It was then that Miss Marple noticed a subtle shift. Lucy Benton, usually so eager and open, seemed distracted, her gaze fixed on the doorway whenever someone passed. She handled money clumsily, her hands shaking as she wrapped purchases. When Miss Marple approached her table, Lucy startled, nearly dropping a plate. She laughed it off, too quickly, and began speaking about her baking as though reciting a lesson she had practiced. Miss Marple listened with interest, noting the careful choice of words, the avoidance of certain details. Later, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Harper outside, taking a moment of fresh air. He spoke of the sale's success, of how people would forget the missing cake soon enough. There was a note of insistence in his voice that struck Miss Marple as curious. People who believed a matter settled rarely felt the need to say so. She asked him, mildly, whether he thought the recipe would ever be found. He shrugged, a little too elaborately, and said such things often turned up when least expected. As the afternoon faded, Miss Marple returned home, her thoughts as neatly ordered as her knitting. The village had revealed much in its unease, its careless remarks, its forced cheer. Somewhere among them was a person who had convinced themselves that borrowing without permission was justified, perhaps even necessary. Miss Marple reflected that such people rarely saw themselves as thieves. They saw themselves as correcting an imbalance, taking what should have been shared. Sitting once more by her window, Miss Marple gazed out at the familiar street, now quiet again. She felt no hurry. Time, she knew, had a way of pressing on secrets, of making them uncomfortable. The stolen recipe had altered the village, however briefly, and in doing so had exposed the fault lines beneath its pleasant surface. All that remained was to follow those lines carefully, patiently, until they led where they must. Chapter 3: The Recipe That Revealed the Truth. The following morning dawned clear and brisk, the sort of morning that made everything appear sharper, edges more defined, shadows harder to ignore. Miss Marple rose early, not from urgency, but from certainty. The village, she felt, had reached the stage where the truth was no longer content to sit quietly. Like a cake left too long in the oven, it was ready to crack the surface. All that remained was to be present when it did. She began, as she often did, with routine. A short walk past familiar gates, a pause to exchange pleasantries, a careful observation of who lingered and who hurried on. The mood in St. Mary Mead had shifted overnight. Politeness remained, but it was strained, as though people feared that any casual remark might betray more than intended. Mrs. Cranwell's loss had become more than an inconvenience. It had become a question mark hanging over every smile. Miss Marple called first on Mrs. Cranwell, who greeted her with a tired gratitude that needed no words. The kitchen was neat to the point of severity, every surface scrubbed as though order might restore what had been taken. Over tea, Miss Marple asked her to recount once more the week before the sale, not the events themselves, but how they had felt. People remembered emotions more faithfully than facts, Miss Marple believed, and it was there that inconsistencies revealed themselves. Mrs. Cranwell spoke of mild irritation at interruptions, of pride when asked for advice, and of a fleeting sense of discomfort she had dismissed at the time. One afternoon, Lucy Benton had lingered after washing dishes, her gaze drifting toward the bread tin. She had asked questions about measurements, about how long flavors needed to settle. Mrs. Cranwell had answered without suspicion, pleased to be consulted. Only now did the memory trouble her. Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, her thoughts knitting themselves into a pattern. Lucy Benton had been nervous at the sale, overly careful in her speech, unsettled by glances. Yet nervousness alone proved nothing. Many people feared being suspected simply because they were young, or eager, or different. Miss Marple knew better than to confuse discomfort with guilt. Her next visit was to Mr. Harper's shop. He was cordial, though his cheer had thinned, worn down by a night of speculation. Miss Marple asked about deliveries that week, about who had ordered what, her tone casual. Mr. Harper answered readily, perhaps too readily, listing purchases with impressive detail. When she mentioned Lucy Benton's name, however, he hesitated, only briefly, but long enough to be noticed. He said she had bought extra honey, nothing unusual, yet his eyes flicked away as he spoke. Miss Marple left with a polite nod, her mind returning again and again to the question of motive. Lucy Benton admired Mrs. Cranwell, that was clear. Admiration could be generous, but it could also be greedy. Wanting to be good was one thing. Wanting to be better, at any cost, was another. Still, Miss Marple felt something was missing. The theft had been too neat, too quiet, for a simple act of desperation. The answer, she suspected, lay not in who had taken the recipe, but in why it had not been returned. People who stole in panic often repented just as quickly. This theft had endured. It suggested planning, and planning suggested assistance, or at least encouragement. Miss Marple returned home and waited, confident that waiting itself was sometimes the most active part of investigation. The opportunity came that afternoon, when Lucy Benton appeared at Miss Marple's gate, pale and visibly distressed. She spoke in a rush, apologizing for troubling her, insisting she needed advice. Miss Marple ushered her inside without comment. Over tea, Lucy's composure crumbled. She spoke of pressure, of wanting to prove herself, of feeling overlooked. She admitted she had copied the recipe, believing she had a right to learn, but insisted she had never intended harm. Miss Marple listened, her expression gentle but firm. Copying, she pointed out, required access, and access required opportunity. Lucy admitted she had taken the envelope briefly, meaning to return it, but before she could, Mr. Harper had arrived unexpectedly. Startled, she had hidden the paper in her basket, intending to replace it later. Fear had kept her silent when she discovered it was gone. It was Mr. Harper, Miss Marple revealed quietly, who had taken the envelope from Lucy's basket when he helped carry it to the door. He had seen a chance, not to bake, but to control. With the recipe missing, Mrs. Cranwell's dominance would fade, and his own influence, as the one who supplied everyone else, would grow. He had hidden the recipe, confident that suspicion would fall elsewhere. Lucy wept, the weight of guilt and relief mingling. Miss Marple assured her that truth, once spoken, had a way of softening consequences. Together, they went to Mrs. Cranwell, and the story was told in full. The recipe was recovered that evening, tucked behind ledgers in the shop, exactly where Miss Marple had expected it to be. The village reacted with predictable shock, followed by a quieter reckoning. Mr. Harper apologized publicly, his authority diminished, his respect carefully re-earned. Lucy faced her own embarrassment, but also found forgiveness in honesty. Mrs. Cranwell, her recipe restored, discovered that sharing it, on her own terms, brought more satisfaction than guarding it ever had. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the matter settled. The cake sale resumed its place in village memory, though now with an added lesson, that secrets, like recipes, carried power only while they were hidden. When exposed, they revealed more about people than about cakes. If you enjoyed this mystery and wish to experience more carefully crafted stories filled with quiet tension, human insight, and satisfying revelations, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps bring these stories to life, and there are many more waiting to be told.